Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 231 Dominant by Xietain, Part 1. Damn monster, Lao Jiang. Beast. I'll kill you. Seeing their teammates falling one after the other like flies helplessly in the face of the terrifying claws of the monster-like human beast, the soldiers shouted and fired with even more fervor. However, all the bullets just bounced off as they connected with the hard metal scales covering the body of the strange creature. It didn't matter if it was light machine gun, rifle, sniper, none of these firearms had the slightest effectiveness against the enemy. Even the powerful bullets of the Type 53 heavy machine guns that were capable of destroying a military vehicle in a matter of seconds seemed to have little effect against the enemy before them. Little by little, the desperation began to accumulate to the point where many men were beginning to hesitate and the thought of fleeing began to grow in their hearts. Moreover, as a consequence of concentrating most of the firepower on the humanoid beast, the enemy party that was being suppressed by military weaponry seized the opportunity immediately without letting it pass them by. Ugh, damn. Groans of pain, piercing screams, and curses echoed across the hellish battlefield. The men dressed as police officers took advantage of the fact that Wang Zedong was attracting most of the attention to come out of cover and began firing like wild beasts at their enemies. Many men dressed in military uniforms fell to the ground with different kinds of wounds, while those who were more unfortunate fell down never to get up again. Gra! Ha 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 ha. Wang Zedong laughed loudly and roared as if he were a cruel and bloodthirsty beast as he swung his claws from left to right. Every time his sharp, hard claws slashed the air, the bodies of his enemies were torn into a pile of minced flesh. His entire body was covered in blood and flesh, giving him an extremely terrifying appearance. Pieces of human flesh were stuck between his claws, while several fragments of shattered bones could be seen on his shiny scales. Low-caliber bullets and normal bullets could do nothing against Wang Zedong under the activation of his second-order dragon transformation skill, and although the high-caliber bullets from the Type 53 machine guns caused him some physical pain, that pain only served to stimulate his fierceness to new heights. For every second that passed, he became more and more ferocious as he raced across the battlefield like an unstoppable dinosaur, destroying buildings that got in his way and burying soldiers inside or simply crushing his enemies with his superior physical body. Meanwhile, Dai Yun was not too far behind Wang Zedong in terms of massacre either. While her ferocity was not as terrifying as Wang Zedong's in his dragon form, every time Dai Yun's seductive and extremely hot body swayed, her enemies could only despair. Every movement of her flexible waist made her look like a slippery female water snake, and no matter how much they shot at her, the bullets miraculously passed just millimeters away from her body. A group of soldiers in military uniform were standing behind an abandoned car. Their fingers were firmly planted on the trigger of their Type 79 submachine guns and Type 81 rifles, unwilling to let them go as these weapons were their only source of confidence and security at the moment. This group of over 10 men had managed to eliminate a group of 12 enemy officers using their superior weaponry, and after expending a total of 4 grenades and demolishing an entire building, they finally buried their enemies in the heavy pile of rubble. They had not even lost a man on their side. Just as the team was about to move to the next location to support their comrades in the squad, a shadow swooped down on them from the distant alley. Enemy, fire! The men shouted at the top of their lungs as they unleashed seemingly endless bursts of bullets. The muzzles of the guns seemed to have golden tongues, constantly spitting fire, and the bright sunlight bathing the metal of the barrels gave them an even more courageous and fierce appearance. Dai Yun's dark eyes glowed with a faint golden light, hard to notice unless one stared into her eyes for a while. Her body swayed gently and her footsteps became strange. Sometimes she advanced, sometimes she backed away, sometimes she turned to the left, and sometimes she turned to the right or crouched down and jumped. Her body seemed to be made of rubber, but the most surprising thing was that except for some blood scratches caused by the piercing wind from the bullets passing within close range of her skin, not even one bullet managed to hit her accurately. Fucking bitch! A soldier shouted in frustration and fright. He quickly put down his gun and brought his hand to his waist before pulling out a grenade. Go to hell! The soldier shouted as he raised his hand high in the sky and gathered strength in his arm to throw the grenade in the direction of the enemy. Dai Yun's beautiful face remained impassive as she dodged the bullets and rushed forward. When she saw a soldier raise his hand, the sun's glare shone on the grenade and Dai-yun's eyes flashed coldly. Her right hand turned into a shadow as she threw a needle made of bone that flew through the air at shockingly high speeds. The mutant beast bone needle pierced the wrist of the soldier who carelessly and out of pain loosened his grip on the grenade he was holding. By the time he and his comrades realized what was happening, it was too late. Bang, 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 bang. With the explosion of the grenades of those nearby also exploded, and these in turn exploded the rest of the grenades. With about 8 grenades detonating at almost the same time, the bodies of the men dressed in military uniform were mutilated into countless pieces. The smell of burning flesh and hot blood hit the ground and bathed the walls of the roadside houses with bone fragments scattered everywhere. The sight was incredibly horrifying to see, but Dai-yun's expression did not change. After wiping out about a dozen soldiers with a single hit, Dai-yun turned the corner and moved elsewhere. Her speed was not surprisingly fast for revolvers, but for normal soldiers she was like a ghost that appeared and disappeared. In just 5 minutes, 60 of the 100 or so soldiers stationed in this position had been killed or suffered a variety of wounds, while the other side had only lost about 20 men and still had about 40 more. Even with numerical advantage and superior weaponry, the defenders were unable to oppose 2 high-level evolved humans like Wang Zedong and Dai-yun cooperating. The area was in total chaos. Blood had begun to slowly accumulate in different parts in the form of large red puddles. Flesh and limbs, as well as the torn bodies of soldiers, were everywhere, and many men finally could not take it anymore as they turned to flee. However, none of these deserters managed to escape. Gra. Ha 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 ha. Arg. Ha 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 ha. And no, Wang Zedong was like an unstoppable beast. Every swish of his claws sent the heads of his enemies flying through the air, and every swing of his tail crushed their bodies, making them explode into a pile of meat paste. He bathed in the blood of his enemies and looked extremely arrogant and self-confident. Wang Zedong looked at the last line of defense, and a fierce smile appeared on his mouth. There, vehicles mounted with guns and Type 53 heavy machine guns were firing in his direction, while the faces of the terrified soldiers were reflected in his reptilian pupils. After we finish with this scum, we should retreat. Wang Zedong thought to himself. Although he was arrogant, he was not stupid. Wang Zedong knew that he could not continue advancing, since at this rate, when they encountered the main army of the other party, even he would be forced to flee. Therefore, he decided that after finishing with these troops, he would order a retreat and report the situation to the main camp. In addition, the pain of being hit by the high-caliber bullets had begun to accumulate and was becoming a bit unbearable even for someone like him. Of course, Wang Zedong did not know that in reality, the platoon stationed here was practically all the other side had as far as armed men were concerned. After all, Zhongde had taken a large number of armed men to protect the southern area, and the rest of the soldiers were searching for survivors, supplies, and hunting zombies. Just as Wang Zedong was about to rush forward and wipe out the rest of the enemy resistance, he saw a young man dressed in sports clothes coming toward him. This young man could be considered somewhat handsome. His hair was as black as ink, and some strands of hair covered part of his eyes, so it was hard to tell what kind of expression he had on his face. The dress and the calmness with which the young stranger walked through the rain of bullets with his right hand in his pants pocket was so out of place that for a moment the entire battlefield seemed to fall silent. Wang Zedong's senses went on high alert, and he unconsciously increased his guard. "Who are you?" he asked in a deep voice as he narrowed his eyes and leaned his body forward like a tiger about to pounce on its prey. The young man seemed to mock him or simply did not hear his words as he continued to walk in his direction calmly. This infuriated Wang Zedong, and his bestial face practically distorted with anger. In the past, Wang Zedong was a criminal who was doomed to spend the rest of his life in prison after committing countless crimes and cruelties against innocents. However, when the apocalypse broke out, police station chief Kong Rong released him after placing several sensor bombs in his body. If Wang Zedong tried to force these bombs out, they would explode immediately and turn him into a pile of mincemeat, so he eventually ended up working for Kong Rong. Wang Zedong was fierce by nature, so after crushing several zombies and other high-level creatures, he was lucky to find a skill called First Order Scaly Lizard. After evolving this skill to second order, Wang Zedong's power jumped tremendously, and although his skill could no longer grow any further, his power was enough to allow him to sweep away everything in his path. Although he did not like being anyone's dog, Wang Zedong was satisfied with his current life. With his strength, even Kong Rong respected him and would occasionally present him with a beauty or two as a gift for his pleasure. This only helped to raise Wang Zedong's confidence and arrogance to new heights. In the past, Wang Zedong had killed a young man only because he did not like the way the man looked at him. Now that the young man in front of him was ignoring him, his anger finally clouded his thoughts. Die. With a beast-like roar, he stomped the ground beneath his feet, leaving a deep footprint that soon spread into cracks as his body shot forward like a torpedo. Wang Zedong's stats had received an abysmal boost after activating his second-order dragon transformation skill. His agility was so high and his strength so terrifying that when working together, his explosive movement speed had reached a level where he seemed to teleport for others. Just as Wang Zedong had arrived in front of the young man, the golden light in Dai Yun's eyes glowed again and her pupils contracted to the size of a needle. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 232 Dominant by Xietain, Part 2 Last. After activating his second-order dragon transformation skill, all of Wang Zedong's overall stats increased tremendously. As for his agility, it had surprisingly reached 190 points. With such agility, Wang Zedong's overall movement speed was approximately 19 times the speed of a human in good condition before the apocalypse and the intervention of the soul record. Making use of all his agility and 220 points of strength to gain momentary momentum, Wang Zedong had reached such a high level of speed that the distance between him and Xietain was closed in less than the blink of an eye. To anyone watching, Wang Zedong seemed to have simply teleported back and forth magically. When Wang Zedong arrived in front of the arrogant young man and noticed that he still did not seem to have noticed or simply did not seem able to react to his astonishing speed, a cold smile appeared on his beastly mouth. He raised his right claw high into the sky and the shining sun reflected on it for a moment before he brought it viciously downward. The wind was cut to shreds, and even before it reached its target, the ground had begun to crack from the immense pressure the blow carried. Boom! A thunderous explosion shook everyone's eardrums, and those soldiers who were 10 meters away felt as if a bomb had exploded right inside their heads, while the world around them seemed to turn white for a moment as their bodies were sent flying by the shockwave caused by the blow and coughed up a mouthful of fresh blood before fainting. Just the aftershock of Wang Zedong's attack, without holding back in the slightest, had sent 5 grown men out of combat. This alone was enough to demonstrate just how horrific his power was. The concrete street split, gravel flew everywhere along with large pieces of broken cement while cracks spread everywhere. Everyone's view was blocked by a big cloud of giant dust that rose more than 2 meters high, half covering the giant body of Wang Zedong, who seemed to have ceased to be human. However, the arrogant laughter expected by the soldiers who saw the beast man as the representation of the god of death did not happen. In fact, Wang Zedong's eyes widened as a glint of disbelief flashed in his previously angry, confident, and arrogant gaze. Just now, Wang Zedong expected his enemy's body to turn into a pile of bloody pulp. With the level of power he had unleashed just now, forget about a normal human or an evolver, even an armored car would be smashed to pieces. However, Wang Zedong could feel his arms almost half a meter in diameter hitting something hard as if he was a normal person hitting a steel beam before the apocalypse. It's no good. Such a thought flashed in the mind of the arrogant man who was previously slaughtering left and right with pride. Idiot. Watch out. Dai Yun shouted anxiously as she suddenly snapped out of her stupor. Dai Yun's active skill second-order third eye was simple and had only one function. It allowed her to feel what was going to happen 0.2 seconds before it happened. It was different from seeing the future, as it was just a feeling that depending on actions could be changed. Thanks to this skill and her amazing analytical ability, Dai Yun could glimpse the best path and the best way to avoid danger and thus defy a hail of bullets as if she were taking a walk in the woods. Just now, out of curiosity, Dai Yun activated her third eye skill and was terrified when she felt that not only did her ally fail miserably in crushing the mysterious young man, he was also completely overwhelmed. Dai Yun couldn't believe it, and that was precisely why she froze for a moment. She knew how terrifyingly powerful Wang Zedong was, but the ease with which this young man in his early 20s defeated him made no sense at all. If Wang Zedong previously felt that something was wrong, Dai Yun's shout confirmed his theory even more. In a hurry, and as if he had received an electric shock, he withdrew his right arm and was about to jump back to put some distance between him and his enemy. Unfortunately, it was already too late. What's wrong? A voice cold as hell's demons came from inside the dust cloud that was slowly beginning to ascend. Wang Zedong struggled and struggled, but no matter how much he pulled back, his right arm seemed to have been caught by a pair of indestructible pincers that were unwilling to let him go. "Let me go!" Bast dash. Boom. Before Wang Zedong could finish speaking, an explosion that was about twice as powerful as the previous one thundered everywhere. As if dozens of grenades exploded together at the same time, everyone on the scene seemed to lose the ability to hear, and the ears of those closest to them began to bleed. A building 20 meters away shuddered violently as the shockwave hit it and threatened to collapse at any moment. The dust cloud was sent flying all over the place in a disorderly manner, and the defending soldiers and attacking enemies, as well as Shangguan Bingshui and those who were faster and had just arrived, finally saw the situation. Bai Zemin, just over 6 feet tall, had raised his left arm to block the previous attack and was now gripping Wang Zedong's right arm with his hand so tightly that some scales had been torn off. Moreover, at this moment, his right fist was in firm contact against the scaly abdomen of the approximately 10-foot-tall giant. Wang Zedong's reptilian eyes had opened as wide as possible, and the veins inside them that were filled with blood seemed about to burst, with his eyes wanting to pop out of their sockets. Finally, as the entire battlefield remained silent, Bai Zemin's cold voice reached everyone and spoke for the second time. "Why you don't roar like before?" Wang Zedong opened his mouth with great effort and seemed to want to say something. However, what came out of his mouth was not words. Puff. A large mouthful of fresh blood with fragments of broken organs fell to the ground like a torrential waterfall. Under the astonished gaze of the soldiers and the men dressed as police officers, the 10-foot-plus giant fell heavily onto his knees. The scales of his abdomen broke into countless pieces that fell to the ground, clearly unable to withstand the power behind the small fist of the human in front of him. Standing approximately 30 meters away, Nangong Yi's and Nangong Lingxin's eyes glittered with disbelief as they watched the scene before them unfolding. Both were aware of how outrageously strong Wang Zedong was. He was the most powerful man under Kong Rong's command. However, such a beast who had slain a 5-meter-tall giant bull now lay on the ground kneeling as he kept coughing up blood mixed with broken organs. This? Nangong Yi simply rubbed his eyes in shock. This is his strength? Does he have a skill that increases his physical condition? But if so, why didn't his body change? Nangong Lingxin muttered as her pretty hazel eyes widened with a hint of disbelief. Shangguan Bingshui looked at her for a moment before looking at the young man who was looking at everyone indifferently, and said coldly, "Bai Zemin is just playing around. He didn't even activate a single skill. Just now, he simply relied on his strength stat to strike." The Nangong siblings sucked in a breath of cold air as the disbelief in their gazes only increased. Although they were unwilling to believe such a thing, if what Shangguan Bingshui said was true, then the young man in front of them had long since left off being human. Both of them had seen what Wang Zedong's strength could do whenever he activated his second-order dragon transformation skill. However, in front of the young man who was barely 20 years old and looked so normal that he couldn't look more normal, he couldn't even withstand a single hit. This could not be considered a battle. This was total domination. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 233, God's Decree. As Wang Zedong curled up on the ground on his own knees and constantly coughed up blood with fragments of broken organs, the whole scene was silent, and the only sound that could be heard was that of the whistling wind as well as the faint groans of the man-turned dragon. On the one hand, the soldiers protecting the northern part of the beginning village were shocked and delighted. They had seen with their own eyes and had experienced firsthand how terrifying the man transformed into a beast was, and yet, that man who was previously slaughtering all of them and arrogantly defying the power of firearms, now lay on his knees on the ground as if he were a weak and helpless criminal awaiting the verdict of the judge of justice. For these soldiers, Wang Zedong was a nightmare from which they could never awaken. They had never seen a human transforming into such a terrifying monster and openly and fearlessly defying traditional modern firearms. However, when the young man appeared, the arrogant Wang Zedong could not even withstand a single strike. As Bai Zemin had his back to them, the soldiers did not know that this young man was actually the main leader of the village. However, it was not difficult for them to assume it. Many of the soldiers had never seen Bai Zemin act in person, so at the thought of having someone so powerful leading them and opening the path, they all felt their blood boil to the brim. Seeing Wang Zedong in such a miserable condition, worse than that of a dead dog, the defending soldiers felt that all their grievances had been washed away for the most part and the hope of living through the disaster shone at its brightest. It was just that the sadness of losing their comrades in arms could never be washed away. While some rejoiced, many others despaired. The officers dressed in police uniforms could not believe their eyes and, like the men dressed in military uniforms, unconsciously stopped firing. It was just that the reason was completely opposite to that of the other party. Boss Wang. Lost, a policeman muttered in a state of shock. How can this be possible? How can this be possible? Another man dressed as a policeman repeated the same words like a broken tape recorder. It's over. One man was so frightened that the Type 81 rifle in his hands fell heavily to the floor. Despair flashed in the eyes of the 30 to 40 or so men dressed in police uniforms. Wang Zedong was the most powerful person in the group, but even he had been defeated with a single punch from the young demon before them. They were aware of what this meant. They would probably be the next to pay for what they did. Just as everyone despaired, the young man's voice traveled far and wide across the battlefield. My name is Bai Zemin, I am the king of this camp. If you wish to live, I can give you the chance as long as you follow me obediently. You all have 5 seconds to throw your guns away from your hands and leave your hiding places. If within 5 seconds you are still hiding, I will assume that you want to be my enemy to the end. And the consequences of being my enemy are not particularly good. Although Bai Zemin did not speak aloud, he had amplified his voice with his own mana. By only spending 2 mana points, his voice traveled several hundred meters across the length and breadth of the scene, making it easy for everyone to hear him loud and clear. While some soldiers might resent recruiting people who killed their allies, in reality, these police officers had not killed many soldiers. Most of the defending soldiers were killed by the man kneeling at his feet and the female with a hot body a couple of 100 meters away. The hearts of humans were changeable by nature, each concerned primarily with what was in their own best interest to do. Therefore, when the men dressed as policemen heard what the young man named Bai Zemin said, they looked at each other blankly and hesitated. While most of them were real policemen before the apocalypse and thus obeyed Kong Rong's orders since he was their superior, none of them were willing to die stupidly fighting against an existence they could not defeat. Don't listen to him, Dayun shouted anxiously. She knew that if the rest surrendered, then she would definitely not have a good fate. She had killed too many of the other party's men and she was sure that she would not be spared. This guy dares to call himself a king. Surely he must be out of his mind. If you go with him, you'll probably end up enslaved. Dayun gritted her teeth and clung on to everything she could. Inside a building 100 meters distant, a tall, fair-looking police officer stopped hesitating when he heard Dayun's words. The man raised his gun and pointed it out the window as he shouted, "Fire!" His strength may be powerful, but his stamina and defense are not necessarily so. Hearing this, everyone felt that such words made a lot of sense. Even Dayun's eyes glittered strangely. Just as Bai Zemin had reached the count of 3, the enemies raised their weapons and began to fire a hail of bullets at him. Bang, 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 bang. The battlefield on the North Road, which had been silent for several seconds, became hellishly loud again, and in the blink of an eye hundreds of bullets rained down on Bai Zemin and Wang Zedong. The bullets were of medium caliber for the most part, so every time they hit Wang Zedong's scaly skin, they simply bounced noisily before falling to the ground. Although he was seriously injured after being hit by Bai Zemin's fist that carried over 300 strength points, his high defense was still present. As for Bai Zemin, he simply injected some mana into the broken bronze bell to stimulate and activate it. Swoosh! The bell flew out of his pants pocket and floated a few inches above his head, releasing an earth-colored barrier around his body. Tink, 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 tink. The bullets bounced off the magic barrier without even being able to shake it. Bai Zemin observed everything indifferently. Although these bullets posed no danger to the current him, the pain of being hit still could not be avoided. Therefore, he did not hesitate to activate his magic-grade treasure. Seeing that their attacks were ineffective and could not even break through the young man's defense, the policemen felt the Reaper's scythe lying on their necks. But what happened next made these men deeply regret their choice. The Grim Reaper scythe actually severed their heads. "Since you decided to oppose me, then you can go to hell," Bai Zemin said with murderous intent brimming. He raised his left hand pointing to the sky and directly expended 100 mana points. Although his face turned quite pale, he wanted to make a great impression here, so he endured the slight seasickness and activated blood manipulation. All the blood on the battlefield, regardless of whether it belonged to the corpses of the soldiers or the policemen, regardless of whether it was blood that was on the ground or even inside the corpses, floated in the air as God's decree. But this was not all. Wang Zedong screamed as if he was suffering the worst torture and began to roll on the ground. The scales on his body began to break off one by one and blood began to pour out of the cracked skin. Soon, blood began pouring out of his eyes, his nostrils, his mouth, and his ears. However, his body was not stained with blood, as all the blood that came out of his insides floated up into the sky. In a matter of a second or two, Wang Zedong's movements came to a complete stop. His once gigantic body, over 3 meters tall and sturdy as a machine, was now as thin as a matchstick without a drop of blood inside. "You have obtained the soul power of First Order Wang Zedong level 33. You have received strength plus 12, agility plus 10, stamina plus 10, health plus 10. Wang Zedong, who had committed countless atrocities in the past, who had abused many innocent young girls during the apocalypse by making use of his superior power, and who had been mockingly roaring and arrogantly killing soldiers, was dead. He had one of the worst possible deaths, as until the last moment he felt his muscles and veins bursting one by one as the blood exploded inside his body in search of a way out. Even until the final moment, his eyes filled with pain, anger, and unwillingness stared at the young man in front of him. Unfortunately for Wang Zedong, while he was strong, in the eyes of Bai Zemin his strength was no different than a fart. In fact, if not for the fact that he was disgusted with Wang Zedong's arrogant attitude while killing his soldiers, Bai Zemin would not even waste his time saying a few words to ridicule him and show him that in his eyes, his arrogance and power were nothing more than a joke. This was the first time Bai Zemin received stat points from killing a being of his own race. However, his expression remained impassive and he continued to work while desperate policemen tried their best to stop him and rained bullets on him ineffectively. Under Bai Zemin's careful control, all the liquid blood began to harden and stretch until it reached the maximum possible and released a slight ruby-like luster when the sun's rays shone on it. Then, all the blood separated and began to take shape as he expended another 100 points of mana. My God! Nangong Yi turned pale and unconsciously took a step back as he looked up at the sky. Nangong Lingxin's beautiful face was also pale and disbelief shone in her pretty eyes. In her pupils were reflected hundreds and hundreds of blood-red spears 3 meters long floating 300 meters above the ground. The number of blood-red spears was so great that the sunlight was partially blocked and a great shadow was cast over the battlefield and over everyone's heads. He is a mage? How is this possible? But his strength. She muttered under her breath before slowly lowering her head and looking at the back of the young man who still had one hand pointing towards the sky. She could feel a great quantity of magic and mana circulating inside his body and around him at the same time. With the strength displaced by Bai Zemin, Nangong Lingxing and Nangong Yi believed that he was a melee warrior with skills meant for close combat. But a magic spell capable of covering almost a full kilometer? This was not something that could be done casually even if one possessed the active skill. Chen He, Shangguan Bing Shui, Wu Ijuan. None of them said anything. Their eyes were fixed on Bai Zemin's back and none of them could help but shudder a little. Some more timid soldiers couldn't help but scream in fright. Die! Bai Zemin declared indifferently as if he was sealing everyone's fate. The hand pointing to the sky moved to the side as if he was swatting a fly out of the way. More than 500 blood spears that previously pointed toward the horizon and formed a wall blocking the sun moved in unison. Their sharp points now pointed towards the ground, and one after another began to fall at astonishing speeds as the air steadily swooped. A simple gesture on his part unleashed a veritable living hell. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 234, Striking Power, Lust, Appreciation, Surprise, Fear. Unlike strength, agility, health, and magic, mana and stamina stats were consumable type stats. This did not mean that the mana and stamina of an existence dropped, it was simply consumed from its maximum. To recover stamina and mana, one needed to rest properly, and depending on the type of rest and the circumstances, the recovery speed would be affected positively or negatively. When an existence exhausted too much stamina, they could walk around and slowly recover their stamina. However, if such an existence stayed completely static, that recovery speed would be far higher, and if they slept, thousands of points could be recovered with one night's sleep. Mana was similar. To activate magic spells or skills that required mana to show their effects, the user needed to have the necessary amount of energy, just as they needed stamina to run at high speeds or fight hard battles to the death. To recover the wasted mana, the user needed to stop not only casting spells or activating skills, they also needed to rest, as if they had lost high amounts of stamina. The current by Xietain had directly consumed 200 mana points in a matter of seconds, depleting almost 2/3 of the mana inside his body. This meant that he could not shape such a horrifying spell a second time in the midst of battle. However, the current him only needed one cast of such magnitude to forcibly imprint his image in the minds of everybody. To warn those who had evil ideas in their heads of the consequences of offending him. Swoosh. 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 One by one, with small margins between them, the 3-meter-long blood spears cut through the sky, tracing hundreds of crimson lines before everyone's eyes. The speed at which the blood spears fell from several hundred meters high was terrifying, to the point where the air itself was slashed into slices and pushed aside. The blood spears were not only falling due to the Earth's gravitational force, Xietain was using blood manipulation to boost the speed of the spear's movement much more. Bang! 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 Boom! 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 Like thunderbolts sent by the god Zeus of Greek mythology, blood spears descended from heaven to punish sinners. The blood spears took it upon themselves to punish those who offended and angered those they should not have provoked. The surrounding buildings began to be attacked by the blood spears, and after several explosions, the houses began to fall. It didn't matter if they were one-story bungalows, apartments with 3 or 4 stories, or buildings that exceeded 5 or 6 stories in height. After being slammed by the spears, all the buildings were crushed and turned into a pile of broken and useless rubble. Ah, help, we surrender, please. Stop. Dozens of armed police officers who were previously shooting at Xietain burst into a mist of blood as the spears pierced through the buildings. Those less fortunate who were farther away from the aftershock of the attack managed to survive a second longer, only to despair in the next instant as their pupils reflected the collapse of the roof and walls above them. It didn't matter if it was male or female, all those who shot at Xietain and who had killed soldiers in their attack on Beginning Village were slaughtered one by one and even died in groups at the same time. Those who were taking cover with the trees on the side of the road or using cars or any other blunt object as cover began to run like a group of ants without a leader. They yelled, cried, panicked, tried to surrender, and begged for mercy. They deeply regretted attacking again when they had been granted salvation, but what they regretted most was coming to this place. Unfortunately for these men who did not know how to differentiate between the strength of their group and the strength of the other party, the blood spears had no ears to hear their words. The blood spears continued to rain down from the sky as if they represented the coming of the second apocalypse. Those police officers, who fortunately or not were considerably far from a building at the time of the destruction, could not run too far as a blood spear struck their bodies with masterful exactitude, causing them to explode in a mist of blood and flesh that flew all over the place. You have obtained the soul power of Xietain level 1. You have obtained the soul power of Lim Chiua level 2. You have obtained the soul power of Yifei level 0. Tiny, glowing orbs of soul power flew from all directions and gathered in the same place, Xietain. The green messages flashed in his retina, constantly informing him of the obtaining of soul power, practically non-existent for someone like him. but most of all, informing him of the death of his enemies, the death of those who did not appreciate the kindness he bestowed upon them. About 30 seconds later, the approximately 500 blood spears floating in the sky several hundred meters above the ground finally disappeared completely. More correct would be to say that all the blood spears had already fallen to the ground, fulfilling the purpose for which they were created. Rumble. Although there were no longer any attacks from the sky, the buildings that had been hit by a single spear but were beginning to crumble finally could not take it anymore and fell heavily to the ground. A cloud of dust hundreds of meters high rose into the sky like a white dragon, making everyone's sight somewhat blurry. But even those who were just normal people could see the world before them. God protect us. The soldiers could not believe the scene reflected in their eyes. Those weaker in mind simply collapsed on the ground and fainted after suffering such a great slide of emotions. However, the ones who got the biggest surprise were not the soldiers on the ground, it was the snipers in the back who occupied high positions and the high-level soul evolvers who had superior eyesight to the average person and were standing on top of buildings. Nangong-yi opened and closed his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but the surprise was so great that there were no words to say. Even for someone like him who was already in his late 40s and thought that he had seen everything, the scene before his eyes was senseless. Nangong Lingxin's knees gave out, and if it wasn't for Shangguan Bingshue's support beside her, she would have collapsed on the ground. Her hazel eyes were wide open and her pupils were constantly contracting and expanding. It was no wonder, because right before their eyes, there was only pure destruction. The former battlefield was far from looking good. Many houses were in bad shape with some about to fall down after suffering some explosions and corpses were scattered everywhere. However, the current battlefield was unrecognizable to anyone. Everything about a kilometer in front of them had been razed to the ground in its entirety. Family homes, clothing stores, small convenience stores, apartments, automobiles of all kinds, everything was destroyed to the point of no return. Rubble and metal parts were scattered all over the place with blood stains decorating the scene as if it were painted on a canvas. Even the farthest trees were not spared from the destruction of the blood spears. The smaller ones simply disappeared, while those that were more robust exploded into countless pieces. The bright green grass overflowing with life force had disappeared, and all that could be seen were large holes of earth ranging from 2 meters for the smaller ones to up to 10 meters in diameter for the larger ones. Shangguan Bingshue sighed inwardly and her blue eyes were complicated as she looked at the back of the young man even younger than her a few hundred meters ahead. She was confident that she could launch an attack similar to this with her ice maker skill and not lose to Bai Zemin's attack. However, she could only do such a thing once and her mana would be consumed in its entirety, leaving her weakened and at the mercy of any enemy. But judging by how straight Bai Zemin's back was and how firm his stance was, Shangguan Bingshue came to the conclusion that even if he could not launch such a destructive and devastating attack a second time, he definitely had the strength to protect his life. He sucked in a breath of cold air and his eyes flashed with terror. He was confident in his fighting skill and was confident that with his improved agility and reflexes he could avoid most attacks. However, faced with such an attack, he would not even be able to leave the area of effect before being overwhelmed. "Are you sure you want to fight against him?" He was surprised to hear the voice beside him. Looking to his side, he was even more surprised to see Wu Yijuan looking at him with a smirk. Hearing that question, he did not reply and simply clenched his fists secretly. That was his answer. But Wu Yijuan ignored him as after asking that question, she looked at Bai Zemin again. Her big dark eyes were shining and as she looked at his back her face blushed slightly. Her breathing turned a little heavy, and she suddenly began to feel some discomfort between her legs, a strange itch that any woman was familiar with at her age. Just thinking about it made the blush on her baby face increase even more and her charm went through the roof. This could not be blamed on Wu Yijuan in any way, as even a cold person like Shangguan Bingshue or Nangong Lingxin who was frightened by the sight could not help but be a little moved. One had to admit that the appearance of the current Bai Zemin was simply too striking. Even little Luo Ning had bright eyes and a big smile on her face as she seemed oblivious to the bloody scene of wounded soldiers and corpses strewn on the ground. Of course, her stare was not lustful or anything similar, just appreciation like children had for their favorite superheroes. Bai Zemin sighed inwardly. The sound of stones that had been sent flying into the sky several hundred meters as a result of the explosions falling to the ground once again was the only thing that entered his ears. The enemies. They had been completely decimated. No. Not all of them. Xietain thought as he looked at the status of his Blood Will skill. Blood Will, 38.1%/50%. There was still one left alive. Ugh. A small groan, so minuscule that it could be ignored, sounded amidst the total silence. That small sound that on normal days would not attract anyone's attention was as clear as the sunrise on the horizon, marking the arrival of a new day and the end of the night. Xietain moved forward, and when he reached a pile of rubble, casually lifted some rocks and threw them to the side of the road. Dai-yun looked at the young man in front of her with eyes filled with horror. Her seductive body was still there, but it was currently covered in blood from head to toe. In addition, her 2 legs were curved into strange angles and her left arm had several visible fractures. Her second-order third eye skill was powerful. But it had limits that were too big. While Dai-yun could feel what might happen 0.2 seconds in advance, it was useless if she could not react in time before the event happened. She was fast, but her agility had not reached the level of traveling more than a kilometer in less than the blink of an eye. Although she escaped from the death, she ended up in such a miserable state that she didn't even have the strength to move a single finger of her body. She was now in the hands of the young devil in front of her. Xietain? Xietain frowned and looked at her in confusion. Even standing from close by and with hearing as good as his, he couldn't hear with clarity what the woman in front of him was saying. Ple. Ase. Dai-yun looked at him with teary eyes and pleaded in a soft voice. Oh. Xietain finally nodded with understanding. Dai-yun's weak appearance, coupled with her extremely hot body, her voice as soft as silk, and the strength she possessed along with that small faint trace of pride in her eyes formed a set of qualities that could charm any man. In fact, her beauty was just below women like Shangguan Bing Shui and Wu Yijuan. Roughly on the same level as Nangong Lingxin. It was a beauty rarely seen. Unfortunately, Xietan's heart was not moved by beauty. Regardless of whether it was male or female, old or child, beautiful or ugly, if they were his enemy, then they had to die. I gave you a chance before, but you didn't appreciate it. Xietain shook his head and raised his right foot high. Therefore, even if the god of the heavens descends, you must still die. Under Dai-yun's disbelieving, panicked, and hate-filled gaze, the young devil's right foot descended on her head. Bang! The ground cracked and several pieces of rubble were sent flying while the heavy cloud of dust was mostly dispersed. Dai-yun's head exploded into a bloody mess with pieces of broken skull and brain matter splattering all over the ground messily. You have obtained the soul power of First Order Dai-yun level 30. Magic plus 20, mana plus 10, agility plus 10. Xietain moved his blood-stained foot away as the message from the soul record flashed across his retina and muttered under his breath, "What a pity. Now I'll have to throw this pair of shoes away." It didn't seem to bother him that a charming flower had been destroyed by him. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 235 Shangguan Bing Shui and Xietain Strange Behaviors. Xietain crouched next to Dai-yun's headless corpse without caring about the blood, brain matter, bone fragments, nor did he care about the steam and smell of hot blood. Right there, a skill scroll lay silently. He picked it up curiously, and when the information on the skill scroll flickered across his retina, a surprised expression appeared on his face. Perception, First Order Active Skill, Level 1, consumes 30 mana points to activate and has no cooldown time. When you learn this skill, you gain the ability to perceive possible future scenes 0.1 seconds in advance. Perception may fail, depending on the power difference between the user and the enemy as a consequence of the impossibility to see the full capacity of the counterpart. The higher the user's magic, the lower the probability of failure. Ugh. A complicated expression appeared on Xietan's face as he read the description of the skill Perception. Perception was a strong skill, but from Xietan's point of view, this skill was more of a double-edged sword. Perceiving something did not mean being able to see the future. It was more like the probability of seeing one of the possible futures. In short, this skill could become a hindrance from time to time. Moreover, it was only an advanced perception of 0.1 seconds in anticipation. Such an extent was insignificant if a person's body and brain could not react at the same time. The user of this skill could know what might happen 0.1 seconds in the future, but if their body could not react at the same time as their brain, then nothing was meaningful. Another thing was the consumption of mana. 30 points of mana for one activation. Isn't this a bit much? He muttered to himself as he held on to the scroll. After some thought, Xietain decided not to learn the skill. There was simply no point in doing so. He was only able to learn one more active skill through scrolls, and from his point of view, perception was not worthy of occupying that space. Xietain was confident that with all his defensive methods, if someone or something wanted his life, it probably wouldn't be that easy. Forget about the broken bronze bell that automatically activated when his life was in danger, and forget about the rejection ring that repelled all solid objects. With the passive skill Danger Sense, Xietain was confident that with his reflexes, agility, and reaction speed, he could evade death. If he died, then the enemy was much more powerful than him, and in that case, perception would not activate properly. He would just end up consuming mana for nothing. Just as Xietain was about to start rummaging through Dai Yun's body in search of treasures, a breeze of fresh air came from behind him. Even without turning around, the scent similar to a snow lotus flower was already extremely familiar to him, so he easily knew who the other person was. "I will do it." "What do you mean?" Xietain asked as he slightly turned around. There, Shangguan Bingshui was looking at him indifferently. Standing under the sun's rays in her sky-blue armor and her silver hair gently dancing to the rhythm of the wind, she truly looked like an immortal fairy. "I will check this woman's body." She furrowed her eyebrows slightly and said as if it was obvious. The corner of Xietan's mouth twitched a couple of times. He stood up and looked at her as if he was looking at a ghost. Do you really think I will do improper things with a corpse?" What happened next was a big surprise to him. "Who knows?" Shangguan Bingshui smiled as she looked at him with a hint of amusement. Her smile was as if she was teasing him, but not in a bad way. "You might have strange tastes? There are all kinds of people in this world." Xietain looked at her dumbfounded. This woman? Did she have a fever or something? In the end, he sighed heavily and shook his head while raising his hands. "Forget it. I won't argue with you. You check this woman's body then. I'll take care of the other guy." Shangguan Bingshui smiled slightly and nodded. Let's do it that way." Since she had her back to the rest, no one saw the expression on her face. Xietain didn't know if she was proving something or if she just did it on purpose, but in the end, he said nothing and simply walked over to Wang Zedong's corpse while Shangguan Bingshui began to inspect Dai Yun's corpse. Scaled Lizard Transformation, First Order Active Skill, Level 2, consumes 10 mana points to activate and 2 stamina points per minute. Learning this skill grants you the ability to acquire various characteristics of a lizard during 15 minutes. It greatly increases the user's agility, strength, stamina, and health. Defense and jumping capacity is highly increased. You cannot use other skills while transformed. This skill must be the lower version of this guy's skill. Xietain thought while holding the scroll. He also had no plans to learn this skill. Although Wang Zedong looked extremely brave and was undoubtedly powerful when he activated his skill, Lilith had previously told him that skills that gave a large amount of power in early stages usually had a short growth range. Xietan's blood manipulation skill or Shangguan Bingshui's ice maker skill, both were powerful skills but not over the top. The reason why these skills were considered powerful was because the users who controlled them were smart and could put them to different uses depending on the circumstances they were in. But these two skills did not give direct power to the user but forced them to think carefully even in the midst of combat. At this point, Xietain had to be very careful about which skill he would learn next. After rummaging through the dried corpse for a few minutes, Xietain found some interesting items. 1 blazing ring, 1 earth bracelet, 1 pair of velocity boots. These 4 were objects that Xietain already had, so they would be given to someone else. However, there was one item that caught his attention. Arachnid silk ring, magic grade treasure. When equipped, it automatically increases agility by 30 points. Allows the user to launch an extremely tough and resistant spider silk web. The skill has a range of 15 meters and can be used once every 10 minutes. Good stuff. Xietain couldn't help but let his eyes shine as he read the description of the item in his hands. As the most powerful soul evolver of one of the heads of a large survivor camp, Wang Zedong naturally possessed several treasures on him. But Bai Zemin did not expect to find a valuable magic-grade treasure just like that. One needed to know that he only had 2 magic-grade treasures if one did not count the one he had just acquired. This alone was enough to show how rare such items were, and as time went by, their rarity would only increase more and more. The arachnid silk ring not only increased the agility of whoever equipped it by 30 points, which was incredible in itself. It also granted an extremely useful skill for all kinds of situations. This skill did not grant physical attack power or magical attack power. Nor was it a skill aimed at hurting the enemy, it was more of an adaptive skill. If it were someone else, they might not find the arachnid silk ring as useful compared to the broken bronze bell or the rejection ring. However, from Bai Zemin's point of view, the arachnid silk ring was even more valuable than the previous 2 depending on the circumstances. He could use the ring's ability to get closer to his enemies faster, to perform surprise attacks, to propel himself further when in the air, to put distance between himself and an enemy, and so on. The uses were simply too many to list them all. This ring was the accurate representation of the phrase "the limit is in our mind." Bai Zemin equipped the arachnid silk ring without hesitation and his agility increased again. Although his natural stats did not change and the soul power into his soul did not increase, his bonus stats received another 30-point boost. He now had 3 rings in total. In fact, he would have more if it wasn't for the fact that the soul record did not allow equipping 2 rings of the same type. Although he had already seen the frost ring and it was a treasure he did not possess, after thinking it over at the time, Bai Zemin decided that it was better for Kan Lan to have it. After all, his survival ability was quite good, but Kan Lan was too weak in that regard. If an enemy managed to get close to her, then the chances of Kan Lan surviving were not very high. But by having the frost ring with the attached skill freezing binding, her survivability had increased another notch and Bai Zemin could feel more at ease leaving the sole healer of the group alone in some circumstances that required it. Soon, Shangguan Bingshui returned with a few things. "You look at them," she said and gave him 3 items. 1 hurricane necklace, 1 frost ring, 1 pair of velocity boots. "You already have them all?" he asked after looking at the treasures. "Except for the frost ring. Although the necklace I wear is different, I already have one and it suits me more." Shangguan Bingshui replied calmly. "I see." Bai Zemin nodded and after thinking for a moment replied, "You keep the frost ring first. My agility allows me to react to any attack, and even if I fail to react, I have my ways to avoid death anyway." If Shangguan Bingshui ended up joining him, then Bai Zemin would naturally not be stingy with her. Besides, what he said was true. While the freezing binding skill was good, it was not imperative for him. On the other hand, it could save her life at a key moment. Shangguan Bingshui's eyes glittered unnaturally as she understood what he meant. She looked at his hands and noticed 3 rings of different colors and appearances, a bronze-colored ring with strange runes engraved on the surface, a crimson-red ring, and finally a silver-colored ring with a vivid drawing of a spider on top. There was no blue-colored ring on his fingers, so obviously he still didn't have a frost ring. "Thank you." She nodded towards him with a weak smile on her face. Although they had their differences like anyone else, at least Shangguan Bingshui was grateful when she needed to be. But who knew Bai Zemin was going to look at her in a strange way? He looked at her inquisitively and said somewhat cautiously, Are you feeling well? You've been acting a little weird lately." Shangguan Bingshui felt like freezing him to death and turning him into ice cubes upon hearing him treat her like a crazy person. She rolled her eyes and remarked, "Look who's talking. You just gave me a rare grade treasure like it was nothing while in the past you fought tooth and nail for even a normal treasure. Aren't you acting weird too? Could it be that you have a severe personality disorder?" The corner of Bai Zemin's mouth twitched a couple of times and he somehow missed the Shangguan Bingshui who rarely spoke. Although her words were somewhat strange and made some sense, from Bai Zemin's point of view it was not strange at all what he was doing. He considered her an important and powerful ally, therefore he was helping her so that she would not die and, therefore, he was helping himself. However, apparently Shangguan Bingshui could see something else or perhaps saw it differently than he did. Anyway, Xietain did not linger on unimportant matters and started walking towards the rest. Let's go back. We'll soon be on the move north. I'm not a person who likes defense too much. I prefer to attack. Shangguan Bingshui shook her head as she thought that men sometimes really were simple creatures. She followed him silently as she equipped the frost ring on one of her flawless white fingers. The first thing Xietain did was to distribute the treasures he had just obtained among his subordinates. Basically, all those who stood up first in the meeting room got a new treasure, which made them extremely satisfied and felt pleased to be chosen by him. As for those who did not receive a treasure, they promised themselves to work harder to obtain Xietan's full approval. Only then could they really feel comfortable in the future. As for the skill perception, Xietain gave it to Kong Lan. Although this skill was not that useful for him, for Kong Lan it was extremely important since as a pure mage she usually attacked from a distance. A skill like perception would be like giving wings to a tiger, more so when she began to evolve the skill slowly. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 236 Officially Joining. As Xietain looked at the skill scroll in his hands, he thought of one person, Luocheng. Luocheng was Luoning's big brother, but he simply didn't have the courage to face the zombies for fear of becoming one of them or perhaps for fear of their grotesque appearances. If the problem was the first reason, then with the scaled lizard transformation that problem would practically disappear completely. Although the skill only lasted for 15 minutes, during those 15 minutes normal zombies would not be able to break through his defenses. However, Xietain soon discarded the idea of giving this skill to him. Although Xietain really appreciated Luoning very much and did not want to see the girl sad, Luocheng was not worthy of receiving such a good skill as he did not have the courage to fight to the death in close combat. Although the first order scaly lizard transformation level 2 skill was not of Xietan's interest, a powerful warrior could be formed if they received this skill or could boost the power of an already formed warrior to new heights. The problem was that except for Zhongde, this type of skill just didn't seem to suit anyone he knew as it went against the style of combat developed and planned by them. In the end, Xietain decided to save the skill for now and decide what to do with it later. Xietain approached the wounded soldiers and began to help them. The rest of them also did the same and applied some simple treatments, while Kong Lan used her 2 daily healings on a soldier who was on the verge of death after losing too much blood. Seeing that even the most powerful leaders helped them to heal and somehow cared for them, the soldiers' hearts were greatly moved. In this world where death awaited around the corner and a person's life was worth less than a gallon of fuel, the action of Xietain and the rest indirectly won the loyalty of these men. If they used to fight just to live better, now they would also fight for these kinds of leaders. Because without them, their future would definitely not be so good in comparison. Moreover, the strength that Xietain demonstrated had shaken many people present. Many had even stopped seeing him as a human being and began to see him as the emissary that God sent to save mankind from catastrophe. Soon, several vehicles arrived on the scene and some people with some medical knowledge began to do what they could to care for the wounded while another group of people began to load the bodies of the murdered soldiers onto a truck. Make sure to bury them all properly. Also, if these soldiers had young children or elderly parents, or a wife from before the apocalypse, be sure to let them know that the government will support them and they don't need to worry about food or having a roof over their heads. Xietain instructed earnestly. The middle-aged man in charge of this kind of work nodded and asked respectfully, "Understood." As for the corpses of the enemies, just set them on fire and scatter their ashes to the wind until there is no trace of their existence left, just like always. Xietain waved his hand and responded indifferently. He couldn't care less about the bodies of those who were his enemies. Why in the world would he bother to give them a proper burial? The middle-aged man nodded respectfully and backed away to begin work. Soon, another larger group of people composed of about 200 survivors arrived and began to move the debris and clear the road once again. Since Xietain took over the village, with the help of clever minds like Wu Yijun, the now-named beginning village became something similar to an anthill where each person had an important role to play and everyone worked together for the greater good, in search of a warmer and less gloomy future. Although, unlike the ants where everyone worked and there were no slackers, in the village there were slackers. However, even those slackers had a role to play in there. Those who were frustrated could simply beat them when they were too stressed, and as long as they did not kill anyone, rape, or the injuries were not serious, they would not be punished. Since certain people were good for nothing, they at least had to play a role if they wanted to keep eating the increasingly scarce food they all worked hard to obtain. If they were dissatisfied, Xietain would be more than willing to let them go to their fate. They would not be able to live even an hour after leaving the safe area of the village. Inside an intact building that was not the target of the large-scale attack launched by Xietain, a small group of people had congregated. Sitting on a couple of sofas surrounding a small glass table, Xietain, Shangguan Bing Shui, Chen He, Wu Yijuan, Luo Ning, Nangong Yi, and Nangong Lingxin drank a cup of tea. People like Kai Jingyi, Kong Lan, Fu Xiefeng, and the others were carrying out supervisions and different tasks that required a lot of care. Therefore, only these 7 people were here. Satisfied? Xietain asked with a faint smile on his face as he looked at Nangong Lingxin and Nangong Yi. The way the 2 Nangong siblings looked at Xietain now was completely different compared to how they looked at him in the conference room when they first met him. But this was also completely natural since so much had happened in such a short time. Previously, Nangong Yi and Nangong Lingxin respected Xietain only because he was the leader of the establishment, and that was all. After all, neither of them had seen what he was really capable of, and while they knew that as a leader Xietain must be someone powerful, the extent of his strength was what really interested them. Now that they finally witnessed the young man's power before them, Nangong Yi and Nangong Lingxin dared not show the slightest disrespect. Both of them sat with their backs straight, and every time they drank their tea, they did so with extreme care, as if they were afraid of making any awkward sounds. Satisfied? Nangong Yi nodded earnestly and cautiously. Extremely satisfied. Nangong Lingxin followed after her brother. Previously she was very proud of herself as she was not only beautiful but also a strong and capable woman. However, after seeing Dai Yun's miserable fate, she finally realized that the young man in front of her had the power to do whatever he pleased whenever he pleased. It was only after seeing the approximately 500 blood spears falling from the sky and turning everything within a kilometer into a wasteland of death that Nangong Lingxin finally understood why even an arrogant, proud, beautiful, and terrifyingly powerful woman like Shangguan Bing Shui was willing to listen to the young man in front of him. Xietain's power was simply colossal. His hand-to-hand combat power was overwhelming to the point that even someone like Wang Zedong in his dragon form was pulverized with a single punch from him. As if that wasn't enough, he also had frightening magical attacks and mana to back up such attacks. He was like a natural war machine and perfect in every way. Moreover, from what Nangong Lingxin and Nangong Yi had seen during the 4 days they were in the village and from what they had come to hear from other people, the young man in front of them did not abuse of his power and even respected those who deserved it. Even the lowest worker was not mistreated by him. But what made Nangong Lingxin hold Xietain in high esteem was that even in the face of Dai Yun's temptation his expression and heart remained undisturbed. She had seen dozens of men fall for Dai Yun in the past, so seeing a young man who should be full of lustful hormones act so calmly was a great surprise to her. "My brother and I are willing to help you." Nangong Lingxin didn't hesitate for a second this time. She solemnly proclaimed, "We will help you become the king of China and establish a new dynasty." Nangong Yi said nothing, just nodded. Why not do it? Xietain did not lose himself in the pleasures of ruling, he did not mistreat anyone, he was not a savage slaughterer, he distributed goods according to each person's contribution and status, he did not force himself on any woman no matter how beautiful she was, and many other things more. But most importantly, he possessed the power to carry out what he wanted to do. Xietain was not like a naive child daydreaming. He actually had the strength to crush everything in his path and break a whole new path for himself. Nangong Lingxin and Nangong Yi were smart people. They both knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and were not willing to let it pass them by. Although they might fail, at this moment neither of them believed that anyone could end the life of the 20-year-old man in front of them. Just thinking about being part of the initial team of founders of a new dynasty and all the privileges they would receive as well as the countless honors the future held for them, the 2 Nangong siblings were for the first time since the apocalypse descended on Earth excited about the future. Victory or defeat. There were no ties, big or small. There was no midpoint. Make it big or go home. Great. Bai Zemin nodded in satisfaction, and the smile on his face grew slightly. With the addition of Nangong Lingxin and her energy barrier skill, many things in the future would be easier for him. After taking a sip of tea, Bai Zemin put down the small cup on the glass table in front of him, and his expression turned serious as a slight aura brimming with murderous intent filtered out of his body. "Let's talk about this northern camp," he announced in a cold voice. Even in the past, Bai Zemin was not someone who liked to take it easy when someone bit him, not to mention someone bit him twice. Although he wasn't hurt in any way, he didn't like the idea of being attacked while he was just defending. Therefore, he decided not only to swallow everything that the northern camp had acquired, but also to wipe out all those who dared to kill his people. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 237, North Camp. On one of the main roads in Rulin subdistrict, a normal-looking jeep was traveling at a moderate speed. The sun's rays were quite strong considering that the day had just begun, and the smell of fresh morning air was traveling everywhere thanks to the immensity of the forests that Yanqing district possessed. Such a sight would be completely normal and no one would think anything was strange about it. However, anyone with a little perspicacity would notice several irregularities. Being one of the main roads of a subdistrict, it would be normal for many vehicles to travel the length and breadth of it, and even some traffic congestion would be nothing unusual. However, the jeep was the only moving vehicle, while many other ones had been moved to the side of the road to allow passage. The sun's rays, while powerful, were far too faint considering that at this time of year this part of China was supposed to be enjoying a hot summer. The smell of the cool morning air that was traveling everywhere actually had a slightly strange smell in it, and if one were to appreciate it more carefully, one would notice that the smell was actually the smell of blood. Sitting in the passenger seat of the jeep, Bai Zemin had a casual look on his face as he looked out the window of the vehicle. Although he had the appearance of a bored person, his body was prepared for any kind of enemy attack because although the outside view was calm, in reality he knew that it was all fake. In this world, such a thing as calm was a luxury that could no longer be enjoyed in its entirety. A day had passed since the beginning village had been attacked by Wang Zedong, Dai Yun, and several dozen armed men in police uniforms. This morning, just as the first ray of light peeked over the horizon, this jeep set off in a northerly direction in search not only of simple revenge, but also to eliminate future headaches as well as to swallow the other side's forces. If anyone else could read Bai Zemin's thoughts, they would probably scoff at him or perhaps think he was simply daydreaming. Attacking a camp protected by hundreds of armed men and with about 200 soul evolvers? Sure, no problem, but with a single normal-looking jeep? It was nothing more than a children's fantasy. No, even children wouldn't have such a fantasy, and only a mentally disordered person would. Bai Zemin turned his face slightly to look to his side and then glanced at the rearview mirror. Nangong Yi, a level 23 soul evolver with a powerful active first-order skill that made him basically immune to a large amount of bullets and granted him monstrous strength, was the driver at the moment. In the back of the jeep, two gorgeous and charming women rode silently. One of these women was Nangong Lingxin, a level 23 soul evolver with an active defensive barrier-type skill capable of blocking all kinds of attacks and with another skill that increased her agility for a short period of time. She was currently sleeping since the night before. She had not been able to rest well after everything that happened during the day. As for the other woman, she was currently looking out the window at her side with her head replete with long silver hair resting gently against the glass. Her blue eyes were dimly reflected in the jeep's window and seemed to shine with countless clear lights at the same time. She was naturally Shangguan Bingshui. At this moment she had reached level 39 with many powerful skills in her arsenal. Her power was undeniable, and Bai Zemin had already seen what she was capable of. This group of four were the only ones who were going to go deep into the northern camp, and when they had a clearer idea of the situation, they would launch a surprise attack. Bai Zemin's lips curved slightly into a cold smile. With this kind of alignment, it was more than enough to finish off the other party. He was so confident. Besides, Bai Zemin's eyes glittered chillingly as he recalled the things whose size had currently been shrunk to a mere 5 centimeters and hidden in a small corner of the jeep's back. Shangguan Bingshui's armor and sword, 2 pieces of armor, and 2 normal swords for the Nangong siblings since Bai Zemin didn't know about them back then, and of course, the rank 2 armor and the greatsword of his own. Bai Zemin really had to commend Shangguan Bingshui for her foresight. Had it not been for the modifications that a large number of vehicles underwent, it would currently be impossible for his blaze-scale greatsword to be loaded onto a normal transport considering its weight. Every 3 hours, the 4 of them swapped turns to drive to keep themselves in good physical condition. Considering that there were 4 of them, each person could rest for a full 9 hours because except for some normal zombies and a few that had mutated into a stranger species of zombie such as Strength Zombie and others, there were no problems worth mentioning. 2 days later, with Tinyuan Town and Xietain acting as borders, a large camp several kilometers long had been set up after the 2 main police stations of both towns eliminated the surrounding threats. After building a safe zone by themselves, Kong Rong and Lu Yin, the 2 chiefs of both police stations, did not stop, and making use of the ammunition accumulated over many years of peace began to slowly but surely spread out. Thanks to the continued support of the government in the past, the 2 men had a good amount of firearms that, although somewhat obsolete, were more than enough to deal with zombies or normal mutated monsters. With over 600 armed troops combined, the camp managed to find plenty of supplies. However, the burden the 2 bosses were feeling was also very great. After all, feeding over 3,000 people was no simple matter. After about 2 days of riding, during which they had to stop several times to remove some troublesome obstacles from the road, Xietan's group had finally traveled about 700 kilometers. Such a distance could have been covered in a single day in the past. However, with the current state of the roads and the appearance of monsters, accomplishing such a thing was just an impossible fantasy to fulfill. So this is the North Camp. Xietain muttered to himself as he gazed into the distance from the top of a huge tree. In the past, the Rulin subdistrict was known to be incredibly attractive for tourism and thus possessed several well-maintained walls and buildings. Even now it was still an attractive sight to the eyes. Xietain saw walls about 2 meters high in the distance and couldn't help but feel a bit jealous. These kinds of walls might not be very tall, but their defense against zombies and some weak mutated beasts was indisputable. It was much better to the wooden walls that the beginning village had erected, even if the height was about 4 times higher. After observing for a moment, Xietain returned to the vehicle and instructed Nangong Yi to continue forward. Stop. Xietan's group had just arrived at the gates of the place when a group of 6 heavily armed soldiers immediately rushed over and yelled. Nangong Yi looked at Xietain first and, seeing him nodding, began to gradually slow down the vehicle until it finally came to a complete stop a short distance from the entrance. The group of 4 got out of the jeep one by one. They all looked at the soldiers calmly, 3 men and 3 women. Although the men got a little heated after seeing the body of Nangong Lingxin and Shengguan Bing Shui as well as their beautiful faces, they could do nothing as the 3 women approached and made sure the 2 of them were not carrying weapons. The 3 male soldiers also confiscated Xietain and Nangong Yi roughly and carelessly. The soldiers even searched the vehicle but could not find anything suspicious in sight. Immediately after the soldiers made sure there were no concealed weapons, a man and a woman approached from inside a building next to the entrance, and judging from the formal clothes they were wearing, they were probably part of the government. The woman, about 37 to 38 years old, approached Xietain and said, "My colleague and I are responsible for receiving the survivors. My name is Mei Lin. You can take your personal belongings and enter the survivors' camp. If you wish to keep your vehicle, it is no problem. However, you need to pay a fee of half a kilogram of rice per day to be allowed to park inside, or you can sell it for the value of 5 kilograms of white rice right here." While there were many vehicles on the road, 80% of them had been crashed and needed to be repaired to varying degrees. In addition, the jeep in which Xietain and his group were driving was an all-terrain vehicle, so it was good for the forest as well as the city. Hence Mei Lin's offer. Of course, Xietain had no interest in selling the jeep. After all, inside the trunk were stored armor and weapons whose value was priceless, considering that they could save anyone's life. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 238, Almost Scaring to Death. Half a kilogram of white rice was enough for a family to eat for a whole week if diluted with water to make gruel. Paying such an amount to park a vehicle was a bit too expensive. Moreover, according to Mei Lin, they were only willing to pay 5 kilograms of rice for the vehicle, which was equivalent to only 10 days of parking. Of course, 5 kilograms of rice was a large amount of food nowadays. A normal family would not have to worry about starving for a long time at least. Besides, maintaining a vehicle in this new chaotic era was considered extremely expensive, as most of the fuel in the surrounding area had been collected by the high command of the camp, and if one wanted to find some fuel, one would have to go deep into unexplored cities, towns, or villages, which meant a high probability of dying. Although half a kilogram of white rice per day was basically a steal, Xietain and his group did not plan to stay here for a long time. In fact, the reason he was not attacking yet was due to two major factors. 1. Shangguan Bingshui had said earlier that she wanted to see what the two camps set up by the government forces were like. Only then would she judge whether she would really follow in Xietan's footsteps or not. 2. If Xietain and his group launched an all-out attack without regard for the consequences, many innocent people would be involved. While he did not consider himself a saint and his hands were stained with the blood of over 100 human beings, he was not a killer lunatic either. If he could prevent the death of those not involved, he would gladly do so. Unwilling to sell the car, Xietain shook his head and said bluntly, "We are not selling the Jeep. We will keep it and pay the parking fee." Mei Lin's eyes flashed strangely. She nodded and pointed calmly, "In that case, you two follow my colleague, and the two ladies come with me." Xietain and the other three looked at each other before parting. Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin followed Mei Lin. Xietain and Nangong Yi followed the man who had so far remained silent. Although they were separated, the truth was that both parties entered a different room, and that was it. After entering a simple-looking room inside the building from which the two government officials had previously walked out, Xietain noticed that there were already two other men present, and both were armed, but their guard was down to the point where their Type 54 pistols were resting comfortably at their waists. The man in formal clothes pointed to a wooden table and said, "My name is Wenru. You are welcome to put your items on the table. We will inspect them to make sure there are no objects belonging to the soul record." "What?" Xietain furrowed his eyebrows slightly and asked. Wenru looked at him and explained calmly and nonchalantly, "You are not allowed to bring firearms inside the base. All firearms will be confiscated and handed over to the superiors, while you will receive compensation in return in the form of food. All equipment or treasures coming from the soul record system must be handed over to the base. Otherwise, it will be considered a serious violation of concealment of goods and weapons." Although Nangong Yi had explained it to him before, hearing it by himself really surprised Xietain a lot. By removing the items from the soul record system of the soul evolvers, the government would undoubtedly have more control over these new rising powers. However, the consequence was to generate great unpleasantness, and in case they encountered a reckless madman, they could end up in big trouble. Such a thing did not happen inside Xietan's beginning village, as he used the carrot and stick trick to lure the soul evolvers to his side to fight for him and obey him. In that way, Xietain could control the entrance and exit of treasures carefully. Such an idea was proposed by Lily, and everyone felt it was a pretty good way to avoid so much trouble. Instead of binding the soul evolvers, what Xietan's group did was to limit them and shortly thereafter demonstrate to them the only way they could break those limitations. Xietain looked at Nangong Yi and nodded. The two put down the backpacks they were carrying on the table and stepped back. The two armed men grabbed one of the bags and opened it. However, when they saw the contents of the bag, both men couldn't help but be shocked. Sweet cookies, milk cartons, candies, sweet drinks, chocolates. Damn. There are even some cartons of cigarettes in here, one of them cursed as he rummaged through the contents. Ha ha ha. To think that someone chose all these luxuries over real food. The other laughed out loud as he scrubbed his hands together. His eyes glittered with greed. The job of receiving the survivors was actually quite good, as the attendants could fish for diverse articles. In fact, these men made a small fortune every day when new survivors arrived. A lot of useless mobs. Xietain thought, and his eyes flashed coldly. He naturally understood the thoughts of the two armed men. But before he could say anything or do anything, a somewhat anxious yell stopped the two men. "Assholes! Get your pig's feet out of there!" Wenru jumped up like a cat whose tail was stepped on and kicked the two men in the butt directly. The two armed men were astonished and looked at Wenru strangely. What was wrong with him now? This was not the first time they had colluded for profit, but now he was acting so scared. When Ru ignored the glares of the two armed men and looked back into the bag in front of him while audibly swallowing saliva. 3 big bags of rice, no less than 30 packets of noodles, flour, spices, canned chicken, and fish. When Ru muttered to himself. This was the first time he had encountered a group that had so much food with them. Such a quantity of supplies was something only the high officials inside the base could dream of. A small government official like Wenru could never come into contact with such things. But what really shocked and frightened Wenru the most was the meat that was stuffed in one corner of the bag. Mutated beast meat. He muttered under his breath, but due to the silence inside the room, everyone heard him clearly. In the past, just by coincidence, Wenru arrived at the house of a high official inside the base to report some matters. It turned out that it was dinner time and that high official's family was having dinner, so after receiving the invitation from the other party, Wenru agreed to join the dinner. It was then that he saw the most perfect meat he had ever seen in his life. As for the taste was heavenly, and the hot rushes that traveled through his body with every bite still remained fresh in Wenru's mind. Even to this day she occasionally dreamed of tasting that meat again. When he saw the mutated meat, Wenru immediately recognized it and realized that the people he was dealing with this time were not people that someone like him could afford to offend. After all, only those who were really strong could hunt mutated beasts. Even the weakest mutated beast had enough strength to decimate a team of 10 armed men if it wasn't hit on the head. Wenru slowly turned around and looked at Baizemin and Nangong-yi. His voice was extremely cautious as he asked, Two gentlemen. You could be. You two are soul evolvers. Since the opportunity to avoid trouble presented itself before him, Baizemin took it with great pleasure. Suddenly, under the astonished eyes of Wenru and the 2 armed men, the young man in front of them vanished. While looking intently all around, Wenru felt his shoulder being tapped behind him. Even without turning around, he already knew who it was. Because the 2 armed men froze in place as they looked behind him with their eyes wide open. Wenru turned around, but there was no one there. A deep voice sounded in front of him, in fact, the 2 of us are soul evolvers. When Wenru turned his head forward again, he was almost scared to death to see the young man from before standing in the same place he was standing before he disappeared. Wenru's legs felt weak and he nearly fell to the ground, as did the 2 armed men. Such an ability to disappear under the eyes of so many people. Such ghostly speed. Unconsciously or not, Wenru touched his neck and swallowed heavily. Fortunately, we didn't offend these 2 people. Wenru rejoiced beyond words. Although he had some position in the base, he was only one of the lowest rungs. If a soul evolver with mysterious skills wanted to deal with a small role like him, even if someone investigated his death later, they would most likely find nothing, and even if they found the murderer it would be of no use as Wenru himself would already be dead. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 239 Inside the Base. What was the use of complaining if at the end of the day you were already dead? No use. Wenru didn't even think twice as he put an extremely flattering smile on his face while closing the bag filled with rice and other types of food. Apparently everything is in order around here, 2 gentlemen. Nangong-yi and Baizemin couldn't help but look at each other. The 2 men with age differences so great as to be father and son thought at the same time that there was one thing that had not changed, no matter whether it was in this new world or the previous one. Without sufficient power, one alone would be mocked and humiliated. Would Wenru be acting the way he was acting now if not for Baizemin's demonstration? Of course he would not. Most probably, at this point, Baizemin and Nangong-yi would have lost all their belongings, and to make matters worse, they would have no place to cry about it. Public complaints before the apocalypse broke out and the old society collapsed were basically useless, not to mention now that the society had fallen and the world was in chaos. Basically, as long as they didn't disturb the interests of the higher-ups and didn't cause a big stir, they could do whatever they pleased. Baizemin could not help but feel that it was a pity that Shangguan Bing Shui could not witness this. He wanted her to see that the camp, which was established by the government police forces, was plagued with black spots. Soon after, the 2 armed men had also carefully closed the bag where the high-calorie foods were before walking away from the table as if they were afraid that what was inside the bags would eat them and not vice versa. 2 gentlemen, please fill out this form. Wen Ru walked over to a plain desk and took out some papers before handing them to Bai Zemin and Nan Gongyi with both hands. The casual expression on his face that he had earlier was nowhere to be seen, and there was only respect and precaution. Bai Zemin read the document and realized that it was similar to the papers that his group delivered to Beginning Village every morning in the central square. Basically, the document was for the survivors to fill out with their skills, abilities, knowledge, the type of job they had before the apocalypse, etc. There was even a special box where you had to check if you were a soul evolver or not. Seeing the looks on the two men's faces, Wen Ru hurriedly explained, "The better your abilities, the better treatment you will receive. Also, since the two of you are powerful soul evolvers and even have some active skill, you will definitely be taken care of by the main forces of the base." "I see." Bai Zemin nodded before calmly asking, "In case we fill out everything negatively and just put our names here, what will be the treatment we will receive?" "This?" Wen Ru was speechless for a moment and did not manage to understand what that question was about. Although he didn't understand why on earth a person would prefer to receive the worst treatment when they could receive the best, he answered honestly, "If you leave all the spaces blank. I'm afraid that even if I want to give you good treatment, I won't be able to. You will only get a house on the west side of town, which is basically the poorest neighborhood where the law barely exists. Even the pigs wouldn't want to stay in that place, believe me." "I see." Bai Zemin nodded and after writing his real name on the paper sheet handed it to Wen Ru. "This?" Wen Ru was dumbfounded. He could not understand the reason behind the young man's choice in front of him. Of course, even if Wen Ru banged his head against the wall several times, he would never imagine that the two people in front of him had no intention of obeying the government, nor were they in search of such small benefits. What Bai Zemin wanted was to let Shangguan Bing Shui see the worst part of the establishment, and then he would take everyone on a tour to the more luxurious areas. In fact, even he himself was curious as he wanted to compare the quality of this base compared to the one he had established. Nan Gongyi handed the form in blank except for his name as well. He put a false name instead of his real one. The base had over 3,000 survivors. It was extremely unlikely that anyone would recognize him unless he went to the luxurious area where he lived before. After all, as a powerful soul evolver, Nan Gongyi and his younger sister Nan Gonglingxin naturally enjoyed the best treatments the base could offer. Wen Ru sighed and shook his head. He simply didn't understand what was going through these two people's heads, but it was none of his business either. "Two gentlemen, if you change your mind and wish to work for the base government, remember to report to the north side. All kinds of workers are taken there. On the strength of both of you, I think you will be able to get a good deal. Although it is not much, I will arrange to have you two and the two ladies outside taken to the house in better condition on the west side." Wen Ru said before saying goodbye to them. Bai Zemin simply smiled slightly and walked out of the room with his backpack over his shoulder while Nan Gongyi followed closely behind with the other backpack on his back. When they came out of the building, they saw that Shangguan Bing Shui and Nan Gonglingxin had already left and were currently waiting for them. Because the two women were only carrying personal clothes in their bags, the inspection went smoothly and without any problems. Also, because the people inspecting them were all women, there were no attempts at harassment or anything similar. "Done?" Bai Zemin asked with a casual smile. "Done." Shangguan Bing Shui nodded without changing her expression. The situation of the documents was something the group had already expected, so they had agreed earlier, and all of them left the papers empty. Soon, the group of 4 was escorted inside the base. Although basically they didn't see much as they were taken in the back of a truck covered by a large tarp on both sides and could barely see the rear view moving away. A few minutes later, the group finally arrived at the place that would be their temporary residence. The building was a 2-story piece of junk. Most of the window panes were already broken and in their place were nylon bags or paper sheets covering them. There was also a small courtyard outside with a 4-meter-high tree and rotten wooden fences that covered the view of the outside. On the inside, there were 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a living room, and what was supposed to be the kitchen. The problem was that except for a bed, the other 2 rooms had nothing. Also, while the bathrooms had toilets and showers, there were no toiletries such as soap and shampoo. As for the kitchen, except for a wooden countertop, there was nothing else there. Bai Zemin was fine with this arrangement. To be honest, except for the lack of furniture and the neglect of the property, this house was quite similar to his home in Chongping District, Yanfeng Town. The two Nangong siblings looked at each other and both saw hidden bitterness in each other's eyes. Before the apocalypse, while they could not consider themselves rich, they lived a good life thanks to their jobs. Also, except for the first few days of the apocalypse, they had been sleeping in fairly luxurious apartments. Even so, neither of them complained because, although it wasn't their preference, they were used to sleeping anywhere. After all, as soul evolvers who often went out in search of supplies, they did not always return to the base and sometimes had to sleep outdoors or inside dilapidated houses. Shangguan Bingshui did not have a big change in her expression either. Instead, she looked at the only real bedroom and asked coldly, "What shall we do with this?" Bai Zemin was silent for a moment before concluding, "You and Nangong Lingxin can sleep here and share the bed. Good for me." Nangong Yi nodded nonchalantly and smoothly accepted Bai Zemin's idea. Although the world had changed and neither of them hesitated to kill regardless of whether it was male or female to survive even 1 second longer, Nangong Yi and Bai Zemin still retained any man's instinct to protect women. Leaving aside Nangong Yi, who could not afford to let his younger sister sleep on the floor and could not take away the bed of a young girl who could practically be his daughter, even Bai Zemin was not willing to let two women sleep on the floor while he slept comfortably in a bed. If they were two normal women, he might not mind too much. But since those two women were his life and death allies, then things were different. Bai Zemin did not realize how complex his heart was and how chaotic his emotions were. Because of the Skillstone heart, his emotions were susceptible to change rapidly depending on the state of the people involved. However, Shangguan Bingshui did notice something and realized that the only way this usually cold and indifferent young man who did not even hesitate to kill his enemies cared about others was when it came to allies. But not just any allies. Allies who fought alongside him and guarded his back. As for the rest, they could basically forget about receiving even a little care from him. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 240 On the Edge of the Abyss. It was absolutely impossible to establish a base without having an organization first. Even if it was a poor structure without much planning, the person or persons in charge definitely needed rules and personnel to work in specific areas. Similar to a company where the CEO was the highest authority, if all the work of the company went into the hands of the CEO, then he or she would die of burnout, and the company would go bankrupt. That was precisely why there were different positions for different areas and different purposes in particular. With the North Camp it was exactly the same. While Kong Rong and Lu Yen were undoubtedly the two men with the most power inside the base, as the most firepower was under the control of the two of them. However, below them there were definitely people working in other areas. Government, civil security, public order, distribution of goods and logistics, etc. There were simply too many jobs and positions to fill. Therefore, although Bai Zemin's group did not know specifically who held what position within the North Base, Kong Rong and Lu Yen should have chosen some people with certain ability or trustworthiness to occupy a place in a government cabinet. Even if these people were not part of the government before, inside this base they were basically petty kings. After a month with no sign of the central government or the Chinese army, it was impossible for those with real power not to start having their own selfish thoughts. Even less so with the lower leader subclass choosing all those faction leaders who exceeded 1,000 survivors. What reasons would Kong Rong and Lu Yen have for not starting their own faction and aiming high to become true rulers? Why would they have to follow a government that had already fallen? Naturally, both men had their own thoughts. People would rather be the head of a chicken than the tail of a dragon. This was an undeniable reality. Bai Zemin's group of 4 had been busy for 2 days in which they could not even sleep comfortably as they rushed northward practically non-stop. Therefore, they were currently quite hungry. "I'll be right back," Bai Zemin said as he walked towards the door of the building they were staying in. Before the others had a chance to say anything, his body blurred and in the next second he was nowhere to be seen. He had vanished like a ghost. Where? Oh, I get it. Nangong Yi was going to ask where he was going but soon seemed to think of something and smiled knowingly. Shangguan Bingshui turned around and walked towards the place where the kitchen was supposed to be and began to look to see if in the furniture attached to the walls she could find anything that would be of use. In the meantime, the two Nangong siblings began to rack their brains thinking of something that might be of use in this situation. Although they had been at the base for about half a month before, the two spent most of their time out on missions, so they were not too familiar with many people. This was precisely one of the reasons why even now no one had recognized them. About 5 minutes later, the wind whistled softly and Bai Zemin appeared in front of everyone again. Done? Shangguan Bingshui asked. Done. Bai Zemin smiled faintly as he walked to a corner and carefully put down some items on the floor. If one looked carefully, one would notice that these barely 5-centimeter items were in the shape of armor, shoulder pads, swords, scabbards, cloak, etc. Although there were a few armed men around, they didn't even notice when I sneaked in. Bai Zemin said as he grabbed some trash and used it to cover the miniature objects. Shangguan Bingshui rolled her eyes as she thought to herself that if he was found by a group of normal people, then he might as well retreat and go take a nap. Let's go. Bai Zemin stood up and wiped his hands. Let's go get some cooking utensils. On the way I saw several hawkers around, similar to a market. Who knows, maybe we'll find something good. I think it will be better if we stay here. Nangongyi shook his head and pointed. My sister and I worked here in the past. Although the chances of us being discovered are not high, considering this is the western part of the base, better safe than sorry. Nangong Lingxin as well nodded and apologized, to which Bai Zemin shook his head and told her it was okay. You're right. Bai Zemin nodded towards Nangong Yi before calmly saying, then, you and Nangong Lingxin wait here. We'll be back soon. Have a good trip. Good luck. Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui said goodbye to the two Nangong siblings and left the small building. Although they had not been able to appreciate it well before, now that they were calmer and had more time, they both finally noticed that the situation in this area was really bad. It could even be said to be worse than what Wenru had told Bai Zemin earlier. In fact, the house they were currently staying in was a mansion compared to the makeshift wooden shacks that were everywhere. As they walked through the streets, Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui saw many people lying on the ground or resting with their backs leaning against the wall of some old house. All of them were wearing dirty clothes in poor condition, while the putrid smell coming from their bodies was practically unbearable, which signaled that they did not even have access to a proper shower. The eyes of these people did not even sparkle, and they seemed to have lost all hope as they awaited the arrival of death. What a horrible situation. Bai Zemin could not help but frown. Although he might not care about these people as an individual, as a human it was impossible not to feel bad for his own race in general. Even if humans were despicable by nature, for better or worse, Bai Zemin was part of them. With most of her head covered to avoid unnecessary disturbance, and with only her blue eyes uncovered, Shangguan Bingshui observed everything with a seemingly indifferent gaze. However, only she knew if her inner heart was as calm as her outer one. Women of her age, who should be enjoying a beautiful and fun college life while forming unforgettable memories, were selling their bodies. But in fact, the condition of these women was a paradise compared to the men. Because she could sell herself to get at least a piece of bread, while the men could only eat their own fingernails. Old men, who should be peacefully enjoying their final years at this point, were as thin as a toothpick while looking up at the sky as if asking what they had done wrong. Just a glance at the miserable state of these people would make anyone realize that they had not eaten properly for a long, long time, and were barely surviving with an existence as weak as a candle flame in the middle of a storm. Unconsciously, Bai Zemin clenched his fist and thought aloud, if anyone dares to betray me, if anyone dares to cause chaos, I will definitely turn them into miserable slaves and make their lives a living hell. Bai Zemin did not feel pity at this sight. Nor did he feel the pride he thought he would feel at the sight of this base's administration being infinitely inferior to his own. What he felt was anger that threatened to burst into a raging flare at any moment. In Beginning Village, even the lowest citizen enjoyed 3 meals a day, an old house but with the necessary comforts to live in, and were even given the opportunity to work for a better living. Compared to these survivors, the lives of the people in Bai Zemin's faction lived on the 9th cloud. This was all thanks to him and the other soul evolvers risking their lives to give them safety. So, if anyone dared to stab him in the back or if anyone dared to cause disturbances that threatened the peace, Bai Zemin would definitely make those people regret ever being born. I think the slavery system might not be so bad after all. Shangguan Bingshui suddenly said. While there are people here who would give anything to live the life that the people in the village currently live, if any of them complain, then they are worse than beasts. Xietain stated coldly. In the North Base, people were starving to death, but they were not causing trouble despite how miserable their lives were. Even though they would be happy to work, no one gave them such an opportunity. In Beginning Village, even the slackers enjoyed 3 bowls of gruel each day. Although they had the opportunity to work, to contribute a small grain of sand to build a better future together, all they did was nothing. Many believed that the slavery system was not good. But seeing the situation in the northern base, Xietain and Shangguan Bing Shui accepted that sometimes, human beings would only learn the lesson when they were on the edge of the abyss. Even the two of them were not much different in that sense. Before the apocalypse broke out and the world changed, Xietain and Shangguan Bing Shui saw food as something natural. For both of them, eating was as normal as breathing, and waking up the next day was something they took for granted. However, it was only now that everything had changed that they realized how valuable these seemingly insignificant and small things were.